The Netherlands just took control of a Chinese chip firm, Nexperia. At first glance, it might seem like a small business decision, but beneath the surface, this move reveals something far more serious, a tectonic shift in Europe's geopolitical identity. From freezing Russian assets to cutting gas ties with Moscow, and now targeting Chinese investments, Europe seems to be moving in lockstep with Washington's agenda. Critics say this isn't just strategy, it's subservience. And if this continues, Europe might soon find itself transformed from a global power into America's economic colony. Let's break this down. How Europe, once the world's industrial engine, is sliding towards dependence on the United States for defense, energy, and investment. Hello and welcome to TFI Global. It all began with the Dutch government's shock announcement taking control of Nexperia, a chip making company owned by China's Wingtech technology. Authorities in The Hague claimed national security risks. They invoked an emergency law called the Goods Availability Act, rarely used, to assume control of the company. But here's the twist: Nexperia isn't a small time player. It makes semiconductor components for cars, smartphones, and home electronics, critical parts of the global supply chain. Wingtech bought it back in 2018 for about $3.6 billion, making it a major Chinese foothold in Europe's tech landscape. Now, with this takeover, that foothold has been shaken. China immediately called it economic overreach, and Wingtech shares dropped by 10% in a single day. And behind all of this stands Washington. Realistically, could the Netherlands or any small European nation take on China alone? Absolutely not. The Netherlands is simply carrying out Washington's agenda. Is the United States executing its strategic objectives through the Dutch government? Now let's talk about energy, the lifeblood of any economy. Before 2022, Europe relied heavily on Russian gas. Almost 40% of its supply came from pipelines like Nord Stream and Yamal. Then came the Ukraine war. In a swift reaction, US forced Europe to impose sanctions and freeze Russian assets worth hundreds of billions. Russia retaliated by choking off gas. What happened next was historic. Energy prices in Europe exploded, factories shut down, inflation soared, industrial gas demand dropped by double digits. To survive, Europe turned to liquefied natural gas, LNG mainly from the United States. Between 2021 and 2024, US LNG exports to Europe skyrocketed by more than 130%. But at what cost? Massive. American gas is far more expensive than Russian pipeline gas. That means higher production costs, lower competitiveness, and shrinking profit margins for European industries. Critics call this a self inflicted wound. Europe hurt itself even more. And who benefited? The United States. American LNG producers made record profits. Washington signed long term deals, locking Europe into decades of dependency on US energy supplies. In short, Europe's energy independence was replaced by energy dependence on Washington. High energy costs are killing Europe's manufacturing base, from steel to chemicals, from cars to fertilizers. Industries that once defined Europe's economic might are struggling to survive. Many are now relocating to the US and Asia, where energy is cheaper and government subsidies are larger. This is what economists are calling Europe's de-industrialization. In just a few years, the continent that once symbolized industrial power has started losing its factories, its job, and its innovation edge. By aligning with the US on sanctions and investment restrictions, Europe has sacrificed its economic autonomy. Foreign investors are noticing this. After seeing Europe freeze Russian assets, many countries, including Gulf states, are quietly moving their reserves and investments elsewhere. The logic is simple. If Europe can freeze Russia's billions, who's next? And now, by targeting Chinese firms like Nexperia, Europe risks alienating one of its biggest investors. China's green tech investment in Europe, electric vehicles, solar, batteries have already slowed. If this mistrust deepens, China could start pulling back entirely. This means less capital, fewer jobs, and slow innovation across the EU. Dependence isn't only about money or energy, it's also about security. For decades, NATO has been Europe's defense backbone. But let's be honest, NATO is the United States. Washington supplies the weapons and sets the strategy, and the cost is borne by Europe. Even after promises to strengthen Europe's own defense industry, most EU countries are still buying American jets, American tanks, and American missiles. Germany's €83 billion plan to produce European-made weapons sounds impressive, but in reality, it's still years away from impact. This security dependence gives the US enormous leverage. Whenever Washington wants Europe to align on sanctions, on trade restrictions, or on China policy, it doesn't need to push hard. The alliance itself ensures compliance. The result? Europe's strategic decisions are no longer purely European, they are American. This brings us to the big question: has Europe lost its sovereignty? On the surface, Europe still acts as a bloc, passing regulations, hosting summits, and talking about strategic autonomy. But in practice, its policies mirror Washington's interests. From banning Huawei to backing Ukraine to taking over Chinese companies, public opinion is shifting too. Eurobarometer surveys show growing skepticism towards the US, with many Europeans feeling their governments are too aligned with European policy. The fear isn't about friendship with the US, it's about dependence. When Europe's energy, defense, technology, and even foreign policy depend on one country, can it really call itself independent? And if that dependence deepens as industries leave, investments dry up, and costs rise, Europe risks becoming what critics describe as an economic and strategic colony of the United States. The path forward won't be easy, but Europe still has choices. It can diversify both in energy and investment by engaging with Asia, Africa, and Latin America on its own terms. It can build stronger internal manufacturing networks and protect its industries from political turbulence. And most importantly, it can pursue strategic autonomy, a balance between partnership with the US and independence from it. Because make no mistake, dependence always comes at a price. The Nexperia case, the shift to American LNG, the rising cost of living, they're all warning signs. If Europe keeps following Washington's lead blindly, it might wake up one day to find that the world's second largest economy has turned into the world's most expensive client state. So, what do you think? Is Europe protecting its interests or surrendering its independence to America? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dive geopolitical analysis. Thanks for watching.